So this is a version of my master's project. It was really prompted by an experience or several experiences that most birders have had, where you're out there exploring your environment, looking at birds, and you see a bird that is, quote unquote, not supposed to be here. You're looking at your field guide, you're looking at your range maps, and you're looking at this bird that is apparently outside of its range. And then if you are an eBird user, you will then log on to eBird and see that you are not alone, that other people are also seeing this bird in an area where it is, quote unquote, not supposed to be. And that's why I decided to look further into this phenomena and see in particular what was happening with the ranges of overwintering birds in South Florida, because as any birder knows, winter is really the time to go out and be birding in South Florida. So that said, introduction, birds. Birds are some of the planet's most studied organisms, and why wouldn't they be? They are beautiful, they're charismatic, they're relatively easy to go out and observe. There are over 10,000 avian species globally, and nearly 1,000 of those can be found in North America, and around 300 of those are Nearctic neotropical migrants. Sadly, populations for birds all around the world are declining. Half of all migratory species have experienced declines over the past 30 years. And migratory birds are a really important group of animals to study, because we all, when thinking about conservation, really need to focus on the connectivity of seemingly separate ecosystems. And very few organisms highlight the connectivity of different ecosystems across the world like migratory birds do. So let's start with some important terms, or bird words, if you will. Passerines are known as perching or songbirds. This is the largest order of birds, including half of all avian species. And then that term, Nearctic neotropical migrant. These are birds with breeding grounds in North America that migrate to the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and South America for the winter. This includes about up to 75% of North America's birds. A lot of folks will just use the term like a migratory bird used to describe these Nearctic neotropical migrants, or they'll use the term neotropical migrant. And I'm just getting real technical here because there are migratory birds that only migrate within the Nearctic region, and there are migratory birds that only migrate within the neotropical region. So we just want to use that term Nearctic neotropical migrant when we're specifically referring to those birds that are going back and forth between the Nearctic region and the neotropical region. An overwintering site is a non-breeding territory where migratory birds spend the winter months. I'll define winter months for the purpose of this discussion as December 21st to March 21st. It's a broad kind of grouping of months, and some folks will use different parameters when describing that as well. And next, I want to talk about migration and migratory flyways. So as seen in this illustration, there are 4 primary flyways. Atlantic, Mississippi, Central, and Pacific are often as they are often how they're described. And looped migration is common. So birds won't necessarily follow the same path north as they follow south. And they're not necessarily going to just kind of automatically know what that shortest distance is either. They are highly influenced by different air currents. They're also influenced by weather patterns, by suitable stopover sites where they can go and rest during their journey. And also they are influenced by feeding sites where they can stop and refuel. Oops. Sorry. Environmental changes are affecting these migratory paths because environmental and climate changes are affecting the atmospheric conditions and the weather conditions. So this is changing different flight paths, which can end up changing overwintering ranges as well. So stopover sites, as I mentioned, are sites used to refuel and rest during migration. Overwintering sites are the non-breeding territories, and there is some overlap, which is one of the reasons why South Florida is a really exciting place to bird, especially during those migratory periods in fall and spring, because we get that crossover of birds that are spending the entire winter here and birds that are just kind of passing over and stopping to find shelter and refuel. And you can just see so many species during that period of time. Limiting factors in terms of these sites are things like food, habitat, weather, competition, predation. They all impact birds that are either stopping over or spending the entire winter in these sites. So, important question, why study overwintering sites in particular? Well, birds spend more time on overwintering grounds than in any other part of their annual cycle, which is kind of amazing. Summer is very last century, because the last century, researchers thought that summer was really the defining and dominant site, the summer sites for birds, because they bred on them, they found mates, they raised their broods. But winter is now commonly viewed as the part of the bird's annual cycle with the largest impact on fitness and reproductive success for birds. Despite this, studies about overwintering sites are still underrepresented in scientific literature, and we need to assess where these overwintering sites are, what birds are using them accurately to inform public policy and conservation measures. If we only focus on conserving sites where we know birds are breeding, where we know birds are, singing and in their summer plumage, and they're easier to study on their summer sites, but if we only focus on that, we're missing a huge and arguably the most important period of a bird's life, which is the time that they spend on overwintering sites. So, as I alluded to, before the 1970s, most researchers kind of depicted birds that migrated as primarily temperate birds who are just kind of traveling to the tropics to escape the harsh winters. And then there was this very influential Smithsonian symposium in 1977, which kind of shifted the conversation. And after the 70s, the models depicted primarily tropical birds using temperate resources during those summer months to raise their family. So if you think about it, these colder areas that experience full seasons, once that spring hits, there is just this huge influx of resources. The flowers bloom, the insects start to hatch, and there's this massive, massive collection of opportunities upon which birds can feed. And that is essentially the nature of migration. It's birds traveling to areas where they can take advantage of less competition and more resources during the time of year when they are raising their broods. The vast majority of migratory land bird studies still focus on breeding season ecology, however, and that's despite winter now being widely considered the most crucial season to a bird's fitness and survival. And this is especially important when we consider that the ranges of birds are changing along with our climate. And the average winter centers of bird abundance are shifting northward. Between 1996 and 2013, 48 different species, the center of their population abundance during the winter moved over 200 miles northward. And if you look at these kind of expert drawn range maps that we find in our field guides and on our bird apps, they're sporadically updated, and there is a high chance that they are reflecting outdated data. And beyond that, in order to effectively conserve birds and their habitats, we need to know where those birds are. We need to be staying current on what their ranges look like. And this is especially important in Florida. So Florida contains 10% of all federally endangered taxa. We have hundreds of native bird species here, and these birds are threatened by a bunch of factors, including human population growth. Of course, invasive species in Florida is a huge problem. Climate change is a threat. And if you think about Florida's topography, the average elevation is 6 feet above sea level. 10% of it is less than 3 feet above sea level. So as the sea level continues to rise, and a conservative model says that we'll experience 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100, you're looking at a lot of those barrier islands and coastal habitats that are likely to be lost in the next 100 years. And not coincidentally, it's those areas that provide a lot of the prime habitat for our birds, both year-round residents and migrants. So we need to really figure out which areas are the most threatened by sea level rise and other changes in the climate in order to make informed conservation plans. Especially during the winter, Florida is an incredibly rich area when it comes to avian species. Between 2001 and 2017, we have 717 species sighted during the winter. And that is a relatively normal distribution when we look at where they are. And you can see, as I alluded to, that deep blue on this map indicates the highest density of bird species and bird sightings. And you can see how clustered around the coast that is and how vulnerable these areas are to climate change and sea level rise. Of those species, 195 were those passerines or perching/songbirds. And in South Florida alone, and this is kind of incredible, of those 717 winter species, 590 can be found in South Florida alone, and 168 of those are passerines. So once again, when you're looking at those coastal systems and climate change, this is kind of a before and after. You can see how sea level rise is going to really affect these ecosystems. So things like hardwood hammocks are increasingly rare in South Florida, particularly in the coastal communities. And one of those reasons is saltwater intrusion. So you can see that freshwater lens, which is where there is available groundwater for plants. And you can see that shrinking as the sea level rises and saltwater begins to intrude. And then you get only a select group of plants like mangroves that are able to adapt to that saltier water to survive. And the hardwood hammocks, which are more salt intolerant, are going to shrink. And along with it, a lot of suitable habitat for these bird species. In terms of Florida and climate change, there's actually less overall warming than in much of North America, but we're seeing an increased severity of tropical storms, both in frequency and intensity, and yet we're seeing decreased overall yearly rainfall. Climate change impacts in low elevations are probably more rapid than in higher elevations, and species in these areas have less time to respond to changes, and thus should be a focus of conservation efforts. Florida is really in a lot of ways ground zero for climate change, and it makes it all the more disturbing that there are so few studies focusing on Florida and in South Florida, specifically when it comes to these changes and how it's impacting birds. South Florida is comprised of the 10 southernmost counties, and this represents the northernmost extent of a lot of migratory bird species winter ranges. And they have a very close proximity to the Caribbean islands in terms of these overwintering sites. And so as these Caribbean islands are affected by climate change, this is likely influencing how and why South Florida is also experiencing different species presence during these winter months. And again, highly underrepresented in scientific literature in terms of this area and its relationship to birds, migration, and overwintering sites. Sorry, that was just a repeat of the change in range shifts. Expert drawn range maps are, or have been, it's shifting now, the go-to for determining where birds are during which times of year. They're used to analyze species' extent of occurrence, and the ranges are represented by a continuous area within outermost points where a species has been recorded. That's why you see them as like blocks of color. This is where this bird is found in the summer. This is where this bird is found in the winter. This is where this bird is found during migration. And a lot of scientific journals, a lot of peer-reviewed articles and research still rely on these expert-drawn maps in order to create a baseline of where species are found and when. And these accurate species distributions are needed to identify critical conservation areas, to see when and how birds are occupying different areas, and to pinpoint what are current threats and what might be threats in the future of different species. Despite the importance of these maps, there's no standardized method for determining the range boundaries and creating the maps, and little to no transparency. When I was doing this research project, I contacted every major source and creator of these expert drawn range maps, and nobody wanted to discuss how they created the maps or how often they revisited their expert drawn range maps. And some major organizations, and I won't throw them under the bus by mentioning them, actually these maps are curated by a single person. And a lot of them are based on anecdotal and outdated data. So it's time to kind of start giving these expert drawn range maps a little bit of a side eye. Their weaknesses include they can be based on outdated or incomplete data. They are often too coarse to accurately predict distributions, and they can reflect range mismatches. And the range mismatches is what I was really focused on exploring during my project. Sorry. And this brings us to avian citizen science. So avian citizen science, or community science, as I really prefer to call it now, is effective for collecting that fine scale data on broad geographic and temporal scales. And avian community scientists have been collecting data for hundreds of years. There are projects like the BBS and CBC, and now eBird is really the premier avian community science hub. And this can help strengthen incomplete or outdated expert drawn range maps. And this graph, I'll just kind of gloss over it, is just goes to show that there is a lot of utility to avian community science when it comes to scientific research and peer-reviewed journals. And eBird was launched in 2002 by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the National Audubon Society. They have over 17 million checklists of avian observations in North America alone. And they have extensive protocols for ensuring data quality standards. So they require all observation process data in terms of how many people were there, how many hours were used in order to become official eBird data. They have automated filters, so any kind of rare sighting is going to trigger a local expert in terms of looking deeper into that observation. And I have personal experience with these regional experts really questioning and sometimes disregarding observations that I've made because they have not been supported by enough proof. Some of the weaknesses for eBird in terms of their data collected. eBird is what's called presence only or point occurrence data. And that means if you don't see a bird in an area, it doesn't mean that the bird isn't there. It just means that you didn't happen to see the bird. And that limits the viability of using this data alone to predict species distributions, just using eBird data. eBird is also biased towards accessible locations. eBird is intended to be used by the everywoman and the everyman, and it's generally the people in the most populated areas that are going out into their local environments, making observation and using eBird. So it's really biased towards where people are and where people want to be recreationally. In addition, detecting rare or difficult to see species can be difficult, and there's highly variable skill levels of observers. So more skilled observers might be more likely to report more difficult to see or cryptic and difficult to ID birds. Common species are often not reported. I'm guilty of this. I won't necessarily go out and report every grackle and crow that I see, but if I see something super cool, I am much more likely to report it. And then of course we have misidentification, which can happen to the best of us. However, the quality of citizen science source data has been shown to be generally reliable when coupled with the data filters and vetting that eBird does along with their observations. So I did for this project focus on some major knowledge gaps. One of them being, as I mentioned, avian overwintering ecology is understudied. Avian ecology in South Florida is understudied. And going in a little deeper, how avian ranges are shifting in the subtropics as climate changes is also understudied. And if there's one area in the United States where people should really be focusing on researching the impact of climate change, it's South Florida. So based on my own kind of anecdotal observations, I had a hunch that current South Florida overwintering ranges on those expert drawn maps was potentially inaccurate. So I ended up mining eBird's citizen science data to determine which avian species have been seen here over the past 17 years during the winter. I compared 3 expert drawn range map sources for all the species. These are really 3 of the more prominent, used, and cited range maps in peer-reviewed literature. And I use that community science data to detect patterns in overwintering species richness, to look at passerine species richness and South Florida occupancy for all migratory passerines. And I was looking at discrepancies between those expert drawn range maps and that citizen science data. And I was using that to determine if the expert drawn range maps for 15 target species were consistent with eBird sightings. And I just created a null hypothesis for the project that expert drawn range maps for the study's target species are consistent with eBird data. So we'll revisit that to see if that was shown to be true or not. And for the project, I was just looking at the 10 southernmost counties of Florida. I looked at 15 target species during those winter months from December 21st to March 21st. I mined eBird data from 2001 to 2017. Like I said, I used 3 expert drawn range map sources. Those were NatureServe, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and Audubon Society. So I extracted eBird data using R, that is the information for species, sighting date, latitude, and longitude. I created these species richness layers in R. I calculated winter sighting frequency for each species. I compared the winter ranges from those 3 expert drawn map sources, extent of occurrence. I looked to see if they were labeled an overwinterer in this area, a migrant, a year-round resident, or breeding only. I identified different range discrepancies between what the eBird data reported and what these expert drawn range maps reported. And then I analyzed those target species and I ranked them by frequency of sightings, and I described the range map discrepancies. And sorry, those differences between the range maps and eBird sightings were used to reassess the winter ranges of these target species and test my null hypothesis. That's a lot of scientific talk for saying I was looking at the expert drawn range maps, I was looking at the eBird data on these 15 target species and seeing, does the eBird data, does the actual sightings that people have in the field align with these expert drawn range maps and the ranges that are in these often accessed field guides and other sources, Or were there discrepancies? Were species seen in South Florida during the winter that were not, quote unquote, supposed to be here? I did choose these target species. A lot were based on personal observations. So I did continually see bird species that were, quote unquote, not supposed to be here during the winter months. I also looked at eBird histograms for Miami, which is where I was at that time, and the NatureServe range maps. I did a lot of cross-referencing with CBC, the Christmas bird count data, with the eBird data, and eliminated 4 species where those 4 species were the Cooper's hawk, the pine warbler, the brown-headed nuthatch, and the great and the mangrove cuckoo, because those look to have year-round residential species here in South Florida, even though other populations of those species might migrate either within North America or within between the Nearctic and Neotropics. And here were my target species. We have the Cape May warbler, eastern bluebird, gray-cheeked thrush, hermit thrush, hooded warbler, indigo bunting, Louisiana water thrush, magnolia warbler, orchard oriole, prothonotary warbler, the summer tanager, Swainson's warbler, worm-eating warbler, yellow-breasted chat, and the yellow-throated vireo. And the gray-cheeked thrush, while it was represented in sightings on the Christmas bird count, was so infrequent on the eBird sightings that it ended up being eliminated from this study because it's likely to be misidentified sightings of the hermit thrush or a vagrant. So I did get rid of the gray-cheeked thrush as one of my target species. And the results. In terms of all the South Florida passerines that I was looking at, all 3 range maps listed 28 species, so they were in agreement that 28 species were overwinterers in South Florida and 28 species were year-round residents. The remaining 112 species had range discrepancies. So one expert drawn range map said that they were present down here during a particular time of year. The other one disagreed. Some of them said they weren't here at all. 40 species did not have South Florida as part of their winter range on all 3 maps. 13 of these are Western species, 17 of these are Caribbean species, and 10 of those were my target species. 26 species were only sighted in December or March, and I, for the purpose of the study, categorized those as migrants because those could just be latecomers or late goers during those migratory periods, and they weren't seen during those core winter months. 25 of those were seen really low frequencies, but none of my target species were considered low frequency sightings. And this is just a graph looking at the average sighting ratio of my target species and the frequency of their sightings during the winter and how they were categorized in terms of their South Florida presence by NatureServe range map, Audubon, and Cornell. And I'll go over each of these species so we can kind of breeze through that. And then this is a target species, species sighting rank ratio curve. It's a lot of words all strung together. But what it's doing is it's showing the distribution of South Florida's winter passerines based on the frequency of sightings. So the little red dots, those are my target species. And you can see that those target species are right in the center of this curve, which means they're neither the most common species here during the winter, nor the most common species. This pattern of distribution showing a small number of abundant species kind of high up and then that really long tail, those are all the low abundant species. That's a common phenomena amongst different locales and taxa. So you'll often see that long curve, that long tail of species that just aren't seen that often, and then just a few scattered species that are really, really common. Those populous species are most often uncommon throughout their range, while only appearing abundant in certain locations or times. Certain habitats and sites can, however, continually favor high numbers of these quote-unquote somewhere abundant species. Studies suggest that these sites are likely to be found near the center of that species' geographic range, which again shows why we really need those accurate assessments, because if there is some kind of center of abundance for different species, we need to know where that center of abundance is so we can track those changes. All right, and this is where we get into the individual species that were targeted for my study. And moving forward, I won't necessarily have labels on all of these different maps, but you can see them labeled here. So that large map in the upper left-hand side, in the left-hand corner, is the NatureServe range map. And then the one towards the center is going to be the Cornell range map. The one in the lower right-hand corner is the Audubon range map. And the one above that is the range maps that I created, pulling that eBird data of actual sightings. So this first species is the yellow-breasted chat. And that was one of the species that prompted this study. And it's also a species where I got to see eBird vetting by experts in action. And they actually disregarded my winter yellow-breasted chat sighting because I didn't present enough evidence for them. And it's quote unquote not supposed to be here during the winter months. And in fact, 2 of these 3 expert range maps exclude South Florida entirely in their range. So they're not supposed to be here as a migrant. They're not supposed to be here year round. They're not supposed to be here in the winter. And yet, if you go down to the southern glades, there is one particular region where local birders know you can find yellow-breasted chats during the winter. And that's where I was, and that's where I saw them. And you can see the sightings throughout the winter on that eBird map. And while they're extremely rarely seen out here in Southwest Florida, they are seen in small numbers throughout Southeast Florida. And that is one major discrepancy with these range maps, with all 3, in fact. The next species is the beautiful summer tanager. This is a bird which is interesting because it actually breeds throughout much of the state of Florida. And then it is basically absent in some of these expert drawn range maps in South Florida. But if you look at the sightings, there are regular sightings, primarily clustered in Southeast Florida, but there are also sightings in Southwest Florida during the winter months, showing that there could either be birds that breed in the northernmost part of Florida that are actually migrating within state during the winter months, or they could just be a different population that breeds further north in the Nearctic, and they're actually overwintering here in South Florida. Another thing I'd like to point out that you can see on the NatureServe map in the upper left-hand corner that you see with this species and with several of the other species, a lot of these birds are known to overwinter in the Bahamas, in Cuba, throughout the Caribbean. And when you think of the close proximity of South Florida to these island systems, and if you think of what I mentioned earlier about climate change and how sea level rise and changing weather patterns are making a lot of these coastal communities inhospitable and uninhabitable by some of these overwintering bird species, the most logical place for a lot of these overwintering bird populations in the Caribbean to shift to is going to be South Florida. So this could potentially be what we're seeing happen right now, where these nearby islands are becoming less suitable be it from increased tropical storms, be it from sea level rise, and they're actually moving into South Florida over the winter due to slightly higher elevation. My next species is the orchard oriole. This is the least cited of my target species, yet it was still cited throughout South Florida a handful of times, nearly every single year for the past 17 years I looked at for this study. It's listed on all 3 maps as being migratory in South Florida only. The next one is the beautiful prothonotary warbler. This is a similar situation as the orchard oriole. It's rare, but there are consistent sightings despite all 3 range maps listing them as migratory only in South Florida. They do breed throughout parts of the state, but that range is also somewhat contested. And that brings up an important point. While this project focuses only on winter ranges, there are more than likely similar issues with summer ranges and stopovers in South Florida too. It's a really broad issue, and eBird is starting to address it. You can see they have these really cool animations on eBirds where they kind of show the shifting patterns of the eBird sightings throughout the year. Yet it's interesting because Cornell is a founder and host of eBird, and yet their expert drawn range maps don't actually reflect the data that is shown in their own eBird project. The next species is the hooded warbler, and they have similar numbers to the previous bird, but it's listed by all 3 expert drawn range maps as only coming through South Florida as a migrant. And it's interesting to note that this species breeds in North Florida and it overwinters in the Caribbean. So shifts in the range of either their breeding territory or their overwintering territory could definitely bring it to South Florida. And this is perhaps what's already happening. It's just not reflected by these expert drawn range maps. The next species, the yellow-throated vireo, nearly exclusive to Miami and Monroe on the Christmas bird count lists, but eBird has sightings throughout South Florida. Only Audubon acknowledges their presence in the winter on their expert drawn range maps. And this is one where I can tell you there is one overwintering right at the Conservancy that likes to attack its reflection in my coworker's mirror right now. So they are definitively here in Southwest Florida during the winter months. Another one, I just had an indigo bunting at my feeder just weeks ago. The indigo bunting, a beautiful, beautiful bird. It's known to breed in much of the state, but some populations migrate to the neotropics for the winter. Some stay here year round. But they have one of the highest frequencies of sightings in the Christmas bird count of these target species and the highest numbers of eBird as well. You can see those sightings are just all over the South Florida region during the winter months. Cornell seems to get it very, very wrong by excluding much of South Florida in the range completely throughout the entire year. And the only way to truly know whether the birds seen in South Florida are from that breeding population or if they're coming just to overwinter here would be to do an exhaustive study during the summer where you are doing nest counts, you are banding those birds that are breeding here, and you're tracking them throughout the year. So there's really no way to know at this point whether the birds that are seen in South Florida during the winter months are part of that breeding population in Florida, or if they are just a migratory bunch of birds from a completely different indigo bunting population and locale. The next species is the eastern bluebird. This is another bird I've personally seen here during the winter months. And you can see, similar to the indigo bunting, they are just excluded from a huge chunk of South Florida. And yet, unlike the indigo bunting and some of the other species you've seen here, they're really clustered, most of the sightings on the southwest coast of Florida, but that is not reflected in these expert drawn range maps. Louisiana water thrush. This is another one I was lucky enough to observe one January when I was working at Fairchild in Miami. They're seen consistently throughout South Florida in small numbers. despite all three expert drawn range maps considering them to be only migratory sightings in South Florida. This one kind of blows my mind. The magnolia warbler is one of the most reported species on the Christmas bird count, and it is commonly reported on eBird, yet none of these expert drawn range maps list it as an overwinterer here. Some of these range maps have since been updated to reflect the presence of the magnolia warbler during the winter months. And honestly, as a birder, I can say it is one of the most commonly seen warblers that I personally encounter during the winter months here. They're a yellow-rumped warbler, a butterbutt, people also know them as, and I guarantee if you go out to some of the trails this time of year, you are going to see magnolia warblers. Swainson warbler, this is just not a commonly seen bird in Florida in general, but they did have sightings, uncommon sightings, but sightings every single year on eBird. The next one is the super cute worm-eating warbler. This is another Caribbean overwinterer that none of these expert drawn range maps consider an overwinter in South Florida. This is another one I've personally seen during the winter months and is another one that is likely kind of being pushed due to different changes in the Caribbean islands into South Florida during those winter months now. The hermit thrush, I've also seen a bunch of hermit thrushes during the winter. Maybe others have had that same experience. While Audubon seems to reflect the eBird data by listing it as an uncommon overwinterer, the others do not. It's not commonly seen, but it is seen really throughout South Florida consistently over those past 17 years. The Cape May warbler, all three of the range maps list the Cape May warbler as overwintering in South Florida, but both NatureServe and Cornell report the species as only overwintering in the Florida Keys. And you can see there's a huge cluster of sightings on the southeast coast of Florida over those past 17 years, which disputes that limited range for these birds. So it turns out, through looking at these target species, my null hypothesis was not supported. Expert drawn range maps for the study's target species are not consistent with eBird data. All of the target species had range discrepancies. The expert range maps didn't agree with them, and the expert range maps did not jibe with what the eBird data reported out. Incredibly, when I looked at the metadata for all of the passerines in South Florida, 66% of all of the reported winter passerines had range discrepancies with the expert drawn range maps. Even common species have range discrepancies. For example, the pine warbler, 2 of the expert drawn range maps do not include South Florida in their range. Any birder will tell you if you go to any pine forest during the winter, one of the most common warblers you are going to see throughout the winter months is indeed the pine warbler. 14 target species all appear to overwinter in South Florida, at least in small numbers, and warrant further examination of current range maps. As I said, that 15th, that gray cheek warbler, the gray cheek thrush, was a question mark just because the sightings were so rare. And the current range maps are likely based on outdated data. And it's also further concerning, as I mentioned earlier, that there's just a complete lack of transparency from these agencies that are creating the range maps in terms of how often they're updating them, where they're pulling their data from, and who is the person in charge of curating them. Oops. So, in conclusion, if there's one thing I'd like everyone to take away from this conversation, it's that migratory birds are an important indicator species. They're going to be telling us what is happening in our own backyard with these broader issues related to climate change, because they're particularly vulnerable to these changes, and they're particularly vulnerable to those changes here in Florida and in their prime overwintering habitats in coastal regions in the tropics and subtropics. The ranges are indeed shifting. and it is likely not reflected in the current maps. More attention in particular really needs to be given to Florida's migratory birds. If you look at a lot of these studies that are tracking changes in bird populations throughout the United States, it will incredibly leave out often the entire state of Florida in those studies, partially because Florida is such a unique case. You know, we're part of the United States, but we're also kind of part of the tropics and the Caribbean. So a lot of these studies just kind of leave us out entirely. This is particularly problematic because these expert drawn range maps are the ones that are being used to inform public policy. So conservation plans, recovery plans, development plans for communities, when they go to make their proposals, and if talks about vulnerable species or in particular endangered species are part of the conversation, they're kind of holding up these expert drawn range maps to say, well, this species is not a concern here because this isn't part of the range. And this is extremely problematic if that species is indeed overwintering here in Florida. And also, we should really harness the power of that community science to help update the range maps and to help inform these public policy and conservation decisions. And I just encourage everyone to get out there, to see what kind of birds are in your own local environment and to report them out onto eBird so that we can kind of keep contributing to this incredible body of knowledge and data that is up to date, that can show scientists and other birders and those who make the public policy what is actually occupying these sensitive areas. And that's it. My thank you list includes my advisors and contributors, and I should really add all of you to the thank you list as well, because I really appreciate you being present and listening to my talk. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Over your 17-year span, did you see a wide rise and fall of numbers, or was it fairly consistent throughout that period?
It really was species dependent. Some species were very commonly seen, basically in some years, and then there'd be a drop off in the next year, or some species were just kind of uncommon throughout the entire period. I did not use any target species that dropped off the sightings for an entire year, just for the sake of the research and consistency. So all of the target species were seen at least in some numbers every year across those 17-year period. But there are going to be fluctuations in terms of sightings, especially with eBird data, because again, it's dependent on, are people going out there to that area that a bird is overwintering in? And then if they're out there, are they lucky enough to see that bird at the time? And that's why it's considered presence only data, because the eBird sighting that a person makes is just a confirmation that that person saw that bird in that particular location. But if there was not a sighting that year, it doesn't mean that the bird wasn't there. It just means that it wasn't reported. Maybe it was seen and not reported out on eBird, or it just wasn't seen that particular year. Yes.
I got a question on your migration maps. Basically, it's one question that has to do with overland migration and over waters, such as we come from the Northeast. We've got sensitive areas such as Cape Cod, and tremendous amount of birders come during the fall to watch the migration. Have you seen any of the wind farms or anything like that, well, we're battling up there and throughout the land as far as affecting the migration of these birds?
Yes, there have been studies done. I have read some of these studies. It wasn't a huge factor in my project, but when you're looking at the hazards for these migrating birds, they are massive. Yes, wind turbines Light pollution is a huge
Light pollution, yes, yes.
And it's incredible when you look at the sheer numbers of these avian declines that are being reported year after year after year. It's some of those things that you mentioned that are contributing to them. Birds are particularly vulnerable when they're migrating. You know, it's just mind-boggling to think about how tiny these creatures are, and some of them travel thousands and thousands of miles. And as you alluded to, some of them, that migration is primarily across open water. So anything ranging from changing weather patterns, increased severity of storms, like I said, light pollution, wind turbines, all of these things are definitively contributing to the dramatic declines in bird populations, because they're affecting the birds when they're most vulnerable, when they're traveling these vast distances and when their energy stores are depleted. So yeah, it's a huge, in terms of tackling migratory bird conservation, it's just a huge, huge issue, which is why, for my project, I really needed to focus on this little tiny corner and piece of the issue, just focusing on the overwintering sites, just focusing on South Florida, because really it's going to take not just a collaborative, cooperative effort between all of the states in the union, but birds don't recognize international boundaries. They don't recognize different policies regulating things like light pollution and wind turbines. So it's going to be a huge cooperative effort, international cooperative effort, in order to really tackle these problems.